Hi guys, welcome you all again with a new topic. And the topic for today's discussion is the spinal cord. We're going to do a little bit cross description about the spinal cord. We all know the central nervous system has got two major components, brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord begins from the foramen magnum and it goes all the way down to the lumbar vertebrae. It ends up at the level of the L3 in the case of the children and in the level of L1 in the case of the adult. As it goes down, it narrows, it tapers down, and that part is known as the conus medullaris. We all know that the central nervous system is basically surrounded by a protective layer, a protective covering, a meningeal layer. We have got three layers of the meninges, right? From in to out. For example, let's just consider we have the spinal cord. Innermost layer, which is actually covering the spinal cord, is the pia mater. And then it is followed by the arachnoid matter, and then we have the dura mater. And now these three meningeal layers are not only covering the spinal cord but the entire central nervous system, including the brain itself as well. As the spinal cord ends up in the form of the conus medullaris, now what exactly happened from the tip? As it goes down, the pia mater shows its extension downward. Now this extension is termed as the filum terminal. Now this filum terminal descends and gets attached to the posterior aspect of the coccyx vertebrae in order to provide a support to the spinal cord. Okay, as we all know, the spinal cord is basically give rises to the spinal nerves. We have got 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. And according to that, this spinal cord is basically divided into segments with respective to the nerves. So we have 31 segments of the spinal cord, right? And now these 31 segments of the spinal cords are divided on the basis of the regions they are covering or they are crossing through, you can say. We have 8 cervical segments of the spinal cord. So therefore we have 8 paired spinal nerves, of course. Then we have 12 thoracic segments, and then we have 5 lumbar segments and 5 sacral segments, and finally 1 coccyx segment. We have paired of all these segments. So that means these 31 segments gives rises to 31 pair of the spinal nerves. Alright, now let's talk about the inner segment, the inner structure of the spinal cord. If we just make a transverse section of the spinal cord, how it will appear to us. Okay, now if we just do the cross section, if we just look at the cross section of the spinal cord, this is not exactly, somewhat it looks like this, alright. So the spinal cord, just like the central nervous system, the other component of the central nervous system, is filled, I must say, it is filled or it is nourished with the white matter and the gray matter. Alright, in the case of the brain, when we talked about, the gray matter was covering the surface and the white matter was present inside the gray matter, alright, or you can say in the inner part of the cerebrum while we're talking about the cerebrum. In this case, in the case of the spinal cord, it's the other way around. That is, the white matter is covering the outer aspect, right, and or you can say it is encircling or it is covering the gray matter which is present in the center part, or it is concentrated in the center of the spinal cord. And in extreme center of the spinal cord, you can actually appreciate a central canal. Now this central canal is continuous with the central canal of the medulla oblongata, and it opens up into the fourth ventricle, right? So let's talk about the structure of the spinal cord. Anteriorly, you can actually appreciate a deep depression along the midline. Now this is called anterior median fissure. Just opposite to this anterior median fissure, you can actually appreciate a shallow depression. Now this is not actually a fissure, it is a very shallow depression which is present in the posterior aspect. So it is termed as the posterior median sulcus. Now let's talk about the gray matter first, and then we are going to talk about the nerves which are basically arising from that. The anterior, or this part which is the anterior aspect, the gray matter which is present in the anterior aspect is termed as the anterior part of the spinal cord, whereas the gray matter which is present in the posterior aspect is termed as the posterior horn of the spinal cord. So we have the anterior horn of the spinal cord and the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and this horn is basically representing the gray matter of the spinal cord. Remember, in the anterior and the posterior aspect. Now, there is another horn which is present only in a very limited segments. For example, remember when we talked about the segment, we have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So the thoracic and the upper lumbar segment have got special horn along with this anterior and the posterior horn, and that horn is termed as the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Now this lateral horn is specifically present in the thoracic and the upper lumbar segment. Now what is the significance of this lateral horn of the spinal cord? It contains the nerve cells which are associated with the sympathetic activity. Remember, we have the autonomic nerve responses, the sympathetic chain which runs along the spinal cord, outside of course, but along the spinal cord. Those nerve fibers are arising from these nerve cells, okay, which is basically arising, which are the components of the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Okay, now this is what in the extreme center we have the central canal. Now the part of the gray matter which is present anterior to the central canal is known as the anterior commissure or anterior commissure of the gray matter. The gray matter which is associated in the posterior aspect of the central canal is termed as the posterior commissure of the gray matter. Central canal is actually a cavity which is continuous from the fourth ventricle, which was present, a diamond-shaped fourth ventricle which was present in the lower part of the pons and the upper part of the medulla. Alright, if you remember, when we talked about the central nervous system and the ventricular cavity, the fourth ventricle is basically formed in the brainstem, and as it goes down it becomes the central canal, and this central canal continues within the spinal cord. So you can say superiorly the central canal is open into the fourth ventricle, whereas as it goes down reaching to the conus medullaris, that is the terminal part of the spinal cord, there it gets dilated into a sac-like structure which is actually termed as the terminal ventricle. Now this terminal ventricle ends up on the root of the filum terminal. So that means inferiorly the central canal is a closed cavity. Okay, so this was about the central canal. Now let's talk about these roots which are basically arising from the spinal cord. The anterior aspect of the spinal cord is associated with the motor responses. Okay, so that means the responses which are basically arising from the central nervous system and they have to go to the effectors, they all end up at this level before they become the part of the spinal nerve and they are transmitted to this effector, to the specific effectors, right? And the sensory information which has to be taken from the receptors, they enter into the spinal cord through its posterior aspect. For this reason, this root which is basically arising or which is present in the anterior, or which is connecting the anterior horn of the spinal cord, is also known as the anterior root of the spinal cord, ventral root of the spinal cord, as well as the motor root of the spinal cord. So it has got three terms, and it carries, as the name suggests, it carries the motor activity, that is the order from the central nervous system towards the effectors. Now the posterior column is basically carrying the sensory, so it is termed as the posterior dorsal or sensory root of spinal cord. Now what is a very big difference between the sensory and the motor root is the presence of the posterior root or the dorsal root ganglion. This dorsal root ganglion basically holds the nerve cell body of the nerves which are basically coming from the receptors towards the central nervous system or towards the spinal cord. As they enter, we have got some cluster of the nerve cell bodies present in the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and they get synapsed here. And from here, a big bundle carrying the same information is transmitted towards the higher center, that is your brain, and the different part of the brain gets involved with that. When the motor response or the motor nerve fiber, which is basically arising from the anterior horn, and the sensory fiber, nerve fiber, which is basically going towards the posterior horn of the spinal cord, they togetherly makes up the spinal nerve. So that means the spinal nerve possesses both type of nerve fibers, the motor nerve fiber as well as the sensory nerve fibers. And as it approaches towards the spinal cord, the motor and the sensory fibers, there are numerous amount of these nerve fibers, of course, they get separated and they go towards the respective horns. Okay, so alright, before going into detail, I would like to explain a few things in this particular diagram here. You can actually appreciate number of cell bodies, nerve cell bodies which are present here. So that means the nerve cell body which is present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, they are associated with the motor responses, and those cell bodies which are present in the posterior horn of the spinal cord, they are associated with the sensory responses. Now, according to the presence of the nerve cell body, they are divided into different groups. Now we're going to talk about those groups, okay? For the purpose of the description and the understanding on the basis of the functional components, the nerve cell bodies present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, they have been grouped into different cell body groups. So we have three different groupings present in the spinal cord, in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, namely as medial cell body group, alright? Then we have central cell body group, which is smallest of the three group, and then we have lateral cell body group. Now this medial group is present in most of the segments of the spinal cord, okay? Because the axons arising from the nerve cell bodies present in the medial group, they are innervating the muscles of the neck and trunk, and also they are involved in innervating the intercostal and the abdominal musculature. Okay, now let's talk about the central group. Central group is seen quite smaller than all the three groups. It has got two components, the cervical and lumbosacral. It is present in two segments, the cervical segments and the lumbosacral segments. The axons arising from the cervical segments are involved in innervating the most important structure of the body, that is the diaphragm. So that means the phrenic nerve with a root value of C3, C4, C5 is basically arising from this particular group of the spinal segments of C3, C4 and C5. That group of the nerve cell body is termed as the phrenic nucleus. The segment, the cervical segment from C1 to C5 or C6, they are involved in innervating the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. Last but not the least, they are also involved in making this spinal part of the accessory nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. The lumbosacral segment has been seen arising, or it involves the segments of L2 to S1. However, the distribution of the axons arising from these segments is still unknown. Okay, so let's talk about last but not the least, that is the lateral group of the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Now these nerve cell bodies which are present, which are actually forming the lateral group, are seen in the cervical and the lumbosacral region, and they are involved in innervating the upper limb muscles and the lower limb muscles. Simple. And this is the reason why they are present in these segments, of course. That's why they are not present in the thoracic region. Now let's talk about another horn which was discussed earlier. There was a lateral horn which was specifically present in the thoracic and in the upper lumbar segment. Remember, we have the small lateral horn. So we have this. These are present from T1 to L2 or L3 segment. Now such groupings are also present or seen in the S1, S2 segments. The axons arising from these segments are the preganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers. Okay? And whereas the nerve fibers which are basically arising from the S1, S2 segments, these are the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. Okay? So we have now these cell body groups are receiving the orders from the central nervous system, and they are going to make up the bundle, the axon nerve bundle, and they will transmit that order to the specific area. Okay, now similar to the anterior horn, we have the posterior horn group cells present. So now we will talk about the posterior horn group cells. And now those posterior horn group cells are basically receiving the sensory input from the receptors, the sensory receptors, and they're responsible to transmit those sensory sensation towards the higher center, that is towards the brain. Okay, the most posterior group of the cell bodies is termed as the substantia gelatinosa, or you can say it is also present in the apex of the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Anterior to the substantia gelatinosa is the nucleus proprius, and in the base of the posterior horn of the spinal cord is the nucleus dorsalis, also known as the Clark's column. And then we have visceral afferent groups. The substantia gelatinosa is basically present throughout the segments of the spinal cord, and it is said that they are composed of the Golgi type 2 nerve fibers. Okay, and this group of the nerve cell bodies receive the informations like pain sensation, touch, and temperature. Anterior to the substantia gelatinosa, there is another group of the nerve cell bodies present, which is known as the nucleus proprius. Now this nucleus proprius group is basically present again throughout the spinal cord segments. They are receiving the efferent fibers of sense of position, 2-point discrimination, movement, vibration. The group of the nucleus which is present in the base of the posterior horn is termed as the nucleus dorsalis. So they are present at C8 and L4 segment, and the nerve cells present in this particular group, or which are associated in this group, are comparatively larger than the other group cells, nerve cells. Okay, and they are basically associated with the proprioception, like the neuromuscular spindles and the tendon spindles. See, so they are present only in the segments of C8 to L4. Okay, last but not the least, we have visceral afferent group, basically lie at the level of T1 to L3 segments, and they are basically receiving the efferent response, or the efferent fibers from the organs of the body, of course. Remember, the anterior horn is basically associated with the motor activity, so therefore they are basically receiving the fibers from the central nervous system, from the brain, and they are the axons arising from these nerve fibers are taking the response towards the effectors, and so therefore these group fibers are present according to the region where they're supposed to supply or supposed to innervate. Similarly, we have the posterior nerve fibers which are receiving the sensory input, and therefore they are present according to the segments from where they are supposed to receive that particular information. Simple as that. This was all about the gray matter, and now let us talk about the white matter of the spinal cord, which is actually surrounding the gray matter. Now, in general term, we know that the white matter basically contains the axons. So that means the nerve cell bodies. Why it appears to be white? The nerve fibers which are basically arising from these nerve cell bodies are highly myelinated, and therefore they appeared white. For the purpose of the description, they are being classified or divided into groups. Like we have the anterior white column. Similarly, we have the posterior white column, and we have lateral white column. So the white column, or the white matter, which is basically surrounding the gray matter, it has got three groupings: the anterior white column, the lateral white column, and the posterior white column. Now these white column are basically forming the ascending or the descending tracts of the spinal cord, or you can say of the central nervous system. For example, just considering the anterior white column, they are present in the anterior column. So that means they are actually the descending tracts. That means the fibers which are arising from the brain, they comes all the way down. They get synapse in the particular group of the nerve cell body. Then from there, the information, the bundle, the axons arises from those specific nerve cell bodies. They make the whole tract or a bundle of the nerve fiber, and that nerve fiber is basically transmitted towards the effectors. Similarly, we have the posterior. They receive the sensory input, and here the specific nerve cells give rise to the processes. carrying that particular sensation, and that is basically transmitted by the posterior white column towards the higher center. Okay, we're going to talk about the descending and the ascending track in great detail in the coming lectures. Well, this is all for today. Thank you for joining me. See you soon with the another topic.